Now we're going to look at, I think, the most important aspect within our defence, security, protection, the idea of the nuclear weapons stroke Trident that we currently have. So we've got a fantastic panel with us to cover that.
Hello.
Hi, Bob, and also Janet, and Isobel, and Bill.
Hi there. My name's Bob Fotheringham. I'm a socialist, and I'm here on behalf of Now Scotland, new grassroots organisation that's been set up to give the rank and file, if you like, of the independence movement a say. My view on nuclear weapons is that they are destructive and indiscriminate, and I oppose them on that basis. They are costly. The money may be better spent on other projects, socially useful projects. And in terms of Scotland, it's undemocratic. The major political representatives in Scotland or in the Scottish Parliament oppose nuclear weapons, and so they're citing in Faslade and the Clyde is something that I believe is opposed by the majority of people in Scotland, and they should be removed.
So that's where I stand on nuclear weapons. All of them.
Fantastic.
Not just
and Isobel?
Yes. This would be Scotland, an independent Scotland's opportunity to make a really substantial contribution internationally if we removed these weapons. And of course, in so doing so, we would, of course, make it very difficult for the UK to continue as a nuclear power. So it's a wonderful opportunity for Scotland to do something that is positive and constructive. There are really only two things on the horizon that could present a truly existential risk to the survival of human civilization. One is nuclear weapons, the other is climate change. Scotland needs to prioritise both of these.
Good afternoon, folks. I'm convener of SNP CND, which is it's a group within Scottish CND where members of the SNP can come together and network and take things forward. Our recent focus has been on Trident removal, surprise, surprise. In the SNP's 2019 conference on motion on a roadmap of Trident removal was passed unanimously. Our next step is to take forward a motion, we'll put it together, on a timescale for Trident removal. That will be underpinned by the frameworks for nuclear weapon removal laid out in the new Treaty on the Removal of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which became international law in January of this year, one of the most exciting developments in the world in relation to the anti-nuclear movement and the view probably of everybody here. Every SNP parliamentarian, both in Holyrood and Westminster, has signed up to the ICAN TPNW parliamentary pledge, along with all of, and that's in both Westminster and in Holyrood. All of the Greens, both in Westminster and Holyrood, have done the same. And as far as I'm aware, some Labour MSPs have done so. And I think possibly some Labour MPs down in Westminster may have done so as well. So our focus from an SNP CND point of view is to take forward and try and expand on existing SNP policy, which is already a roadmap and Trident removal was passed unanimously, as I said, in the conference in 2019. And at the next opportunity, we intend to take forward something on timescales. Thanks.
Bill, picking up from the TNPW, what is the kind of likely timescale of removal? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said that was kind of covered in that agreement.
It's not. The timescale is still to be within the TPNW, and Janet actually she's the Scottish representative in ICAN, and we'll be able to say a bit more about that. But as of this moment in time, a timescale in terms of TPNW is still to be fleshed out. We had, before the TPNW became law, we were looking at a timescale of between 3 and 5 years, and that sort of fits within the TPNW rubric. But maybe we can get into some more detail on that. On relation to the TPNW and its workings, as I say, the Scottish Government would, when it became independent, it would become a signatory. It would ratify the TPNW. 54 countries currently ratified it, and that's growing because over 100, and Janet will remind us, 160 or whatever it was, actually put the process in motion. But then we would have the resources of the United Nations institutions that would become involved in helping Scotland and the remainder of the UK remove a Trident from Scotland. For instance, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that would be one of the institutions that would be involved.
Well, that's really interesting. So this kind of really daunting task that we were kind of covering so far, there would be help from other institutions. And I would almost say it looks like we've got a bit of a roadmap towards that as well with the treaty. Janet, could I bring you in to expand on that?
Yeah. Yes, if I could please, just to say that the most significant thing about the getting rid of the weapons is that would not be determined if we accede to the treaty, if an independent Scotland accedes to the treaty, and it would mean that the timescale would be determined by the first meeting of state parties, which is going to happen in January. That's the first meeting of the countries that have fully ratified the treaty. And there are discussions going on at the present time about what would be required for removal. And John's paper is definitely one of the things that's being considered by the international community and the experts and academics looking at that, because his document deals with removal, which is slightly different from destruction, which is what the treaty would require us to do. But it wouldn't require Scotland to do that because they're the UK's weapons. We could insist that they were removed immediately within a removal framework, which at the moment is looking like being a maximum of 5 years for any country, with a 10-year window for actually taking the things so completely apart that they could never be reconstituted as a nuclear weapon. So coupled with the fact that the UK government doesn't have anywhere else to put them, Scotland's acceding to the treaty, an independent Scotland acceding to the treaty, or even a pre-independent Scotland absolutely committing to that, really gives the UK government cause to recognise that its nuclear weapons are on a sugary nail. And I mean, this is something that the whole world wants. We had a very interesting meeting with an Irish parliamentarian at the cross-party group on nuclear disarmament in the Scottish Parliament. And they passed the terms of the treaty into their national legislation unanimously, both the lower and the upper house. It was unanimous. And our parliamentarians were pretty gobsmacked by that and said, how did you get it through? How was it unanimous? How did you manage that? And the guy just said, nuclear weapons, it's a no-brainer. They don't, you know, it's only in countries that actually have nuclear weapons that anyone is convinced that they have any functionality whatsoever. They're just unbelievably dangerous.
I would say that it's all right to say the UK's nuclear weapons, if Scotland demanded removal, wouldn't have anywhere else to go. This is the case, which makes the situation of the UK state desperate to ensure that doesn't happen. So we have to be aware of that. And we all know that in any negotiations, if you sense that the other side has a bit of flexibility, that there's a bit of movement there, then you really ramp up the pressure. You ramp up the bribery, you ramp up the threats, and Scotland would experience this from the rest of the UK and from NATO. But if you're absolutely clear that the other side is completely rigid and firm, you recognise you're on to something which you're not going to win. And therefore you don't put the same effort in, which is why it's so, so important that our timescale, our programme for this is very clear, and we make it if we make it clear to all that this is a triple red line.
Has anyone worked out the UK's likely negotiating position to the Trident issue in the event of a yes vote in the future referendum, and how strongly the issue will figure in the UK's behaviour leading up to a referendum? And Bill, would you like to come in on that one?
Well, where they are is basically considered confidential and a state secret. They're not going to release their hand, though I did take part in a recent Ramsay seminar, and I put the following question. It was done under Charterhouse rules, so you're not meant to say who said what and all the rest of it, and I will stick to that because I will be attending other seminars in the future. And I put the following question. Every professional navy in the world does contingency planning in terms of alternative basing. Are you telling, does contingency planning take place in relation to Britain's nuclear, the Trident fleet, in fact, all its assets? And the question was then put to the speaker in the panel, who will remain nameless. But the moderator from Ramsay confirmed that point even before I put the question, that contingency planning is part of their processes. That was a response I got from them. So I must assume, therefore, that they were not telling a porky. Maybe someone was, maybe two folk were. But I can only give you what I was truthfully told, well, what I was told.
That would be good. Sorry, it's difficult when it's things you're very familiar with. John's paper is John Ainsley's paper on the removal of Trident. It's called Nowhere to Go. It's available on the Scottish CND website. And it's a very carefully researched and conservative estimate of how long it would take to get rid of Trident from Scotland. And it's accepted as an authoritative estimate at an international level. So that's what John's paper is. The point I wanted to make about NATO is actually in relation to two reports that ICAN have just in the last week or so produced. One is on spending on nuclear weapons, which, as everyone knows, is astronomical. But one of the things that is particularly notable from that report is the amount of spending that nuclear weapons producers, spend on lobbying governments and on independent think tanks. And I can't remember because I'm not very good at statistics, but the figure that is given to RUSI runs into absolutely enormous amounts of money that are paid to RUSI by nuclear weapons producers. And I think it's very important to be aware of that. And I'm very grateful to ICAN for producing this report. And you can access that on the ICAN website or on the Scottish version, which is nuclearban.scot. But the other report that they've just produced is a report on NATO in relation to its own objectives. And I mean, all the way through the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there was huge opposition from the US government, along with the other nuclear armed states. And a lot of that was expressed in rhetoric around NATO, which has a nuclear armed policy. But it is only a policy. It's not in the treaty. It's not an essential part of how NATO operates. Now, personally, I have a problem with military alliances which are not democratically controlled, of which NATO is definitely one of. But aside from that, there is absolutely no reason and everything in NATO's own stated objectives to suggest it should now be thinking about ceasing to be a nuclear armed state. If you're operating in a world where there are countries that are already bound by the terms of the treaty, and you're looking at international financing and resourcing, it's crazy to be doing something that you may find yourself in a litigious, difficult situation in one country as opposed to another.
A question from our audience then, from building onto your point there, Janet, is it feasible and or realistic that Scotland can remove nuclear weapons and stay in NATO? Do you just want to very briefly give me a yes or no, the four of you?
So I think the answer to that is that I don't want, for other reasons, to be in NATO. But I think if Scotland, before applying for NATO membership, had got that agreement and started the process of removing nuclear weapons, then I don't think there would be a rejection of Scotland's application for NATO membership for other reasons, because it's an organisation, like so many organisations, that wants to expand and develop, see this as part of its strength. So in that sense, I don't think it would. Morally, I think there are other issues, as long as the key dominant players of NATO and in its policy was nuclear related. But just one point I would quickly like to put in, because it's one that will come up, will be used against us in any independence campaign, is that there are not many Scottish jobs that are Trident dependent. The warheads are built in Burfield, down in the south of England. It's in Barrow that the submarines are built. The Trident missiles themselves come from the United States, go back there for servicing. So there is really comparatively little by way of jobs in Scotland. And there are more around the other UK submarines. That's the Astute class and others, which are going to be increasing in number under existing plans. That is another issue that will have to be dealt with. But Faslane can be used as a military centre by an independent Scotland.
As I say, I think the key is stay, because we would, if an independent Scotland would, as Isobel says, apply to become part of NATO on its own terms, and could do so with its own terms and conditions. The paper that I referred to that ICAN have produced is aimed at countries that are already in NATO and how they can attempt to negotiate with NATO that they give up their nuclear weapons. That's the direction of travel. So a new country coming into membership of NATO would very easily be able to make that a term and condition of membership. Like Isobel, I think it would be a retrograde step, and it would tie Scottish security to allies that are not necessarily likely to share our wish to contribute to the international peace movement, rather than an aggressive expansion and control of countries where we have no business.
So you're both in agreement. Bob, will you quickly have your views on that?
Yeah. My view is that it's incompatible for Scotland to be saying they want rid of nuclear weapons and be part of NATO. NATO is defined as a nuclear club, even though people may say otherwise. It's about power, it's about influence, it's about domination by certain big powers in the world, and having nuclear weapons as part of that. I think by the SNP tying themselves up with NATO, the pressure will be put on them to keep nuclear weapons, to delay the removal of Trident from Scotland. I mean, I'm in favour of international agreements, but ultimately, as we know in the climate change movement, agreements lead very little on an international level. It takes pressure from below, from ordinary people, to campaign and fight to get rid of nuclear weapons. So I'm very much on the side of actually mass action, potentially civil disobedience to get rid of nuclear weapons. I don't think we can leave it to the politicians. They will renege, they will obfuscate, they will delay. It's going to be ultimately, I think, down to the actions of ordinary people if we're going to get rid of nuclear weapons.
Well, Scotland probably could remain in NATO. There's other issues about that which have been aired, and I share many of them. But in terms of public opinion, There are the elites that run things, and there are the republics. And this week, I mean, NATO is an organisation with all different positions in it, although the nuclear aspect is one we don't agree with. But take, for instance, the countries that already host American weapons. Public in their ICAN, the same report, I think it's one of the reports, ICAN reports Jan's referred to. Belgium, 57%. These are people who think the American bombs in their countries should go now. Belgium, 57%. Netherlands, 58%. Germany, 83%. Italy, 74%. They're all think that the American weapons should go. And in relation to the TPNW, which NATO doesn't like, of the publics in NATO who have been polled on it by ICAN, these are the results of some of the countries that think, you know, have been asked about signing up. NATO countries signing up to TPNW. The publics: Norway 78%, Iceland 86%, Belgium 77%, Canada 74%, Denmark 78%, France 67%, Germany 68%, Italy 87%, Netherlands 78%, Spain 89%, and even in the UK 58% think that their government should sign up to the TPNW, and they're all in NATO. So we can use public pressure that Bob refers to, but also to put on the pressure of the politicians. So therefore, I think that getting rid of Trident from Scotland is definitely a credible option. Although various folk will say that it's incompatible, both from different positions. Folk who are very pro-nuclear will say you can't do it, and some folk who think, you know, otherwise will say, you know, NATO membership is incompatible. But at the end of the day, NATO knows that Scotland, you know, it's not far from Ireland. So in that sense, the Scots could turn around and say, who cares? We don't need to be in NATO. You know, they know that. They know the public understand that. So we have that card. Basic public opinion. No, we're not going to be invaded by anybody. And the idea of NATO membership, public opinion, probably a slight majority in favour because of the media. But really, when it comes down to it, the public don't care. I wish they did care more, but that actually is a potential ace card for us to get rid of Trident, to leave it in the country.
Great. Oh, thank you, Bill. We'll concentrating on that idea of the civil disobedience as the furthest extent of public opposition to Trident and possibly NATO. Janet, what's your thoughts on how a mass movement would or could develop around the removal of Trident and also possibly our involvement in NATO?
I think direct action at the base for a year was what delivered, in a large part, the political will to vote in a government that clearly, you know, we won politically in Scotland. The argument about nuclear weapons is won. Politically, we've won the argument. The problem is that we're in complete democratic deficit. So removal of consent for these things becomes, for me at least, a pressing matter, you know. And there are a number of different ways in which that could be done in terms of mass action at Faslane or stopping the convoys, or there are all sorts of things that could be done, and I would like to see them done. But the UK government governs by consent. I agree wholeheartedly with Isobel that the idea that we can get rid of nuclear weapons with independence is a very large part of the reason why they fought, bit and scratched their way backwards from the last referendum and cheated in all sorts of ways that prevented us from obtaining our independence. I think that, you know, I think we have to recognize that we have already won politically on the issue of nuclear weapons.
I think that's an important point, Bob, if it's okay, thank you, Janet. Bob, if you could come in there, are you in agreement that we've won politically, or do you think there's still much more work to be done in terms of the kind of public view of nuclear and NATO?
No, I think, I mean, clearly, in terms of political representation in Scotland, the argument has been won, I think. I mean, if you, it's one of the touchstones of the independence movement. You go out and talk to people who are actually actively campaigning, particularly for independence. You find that one of the issues that fires them up is the whole issue of Trident and nuclear weapons and getting rid of them. So I think, I mean, obviously, to a certain extent, there's areas in Scottish society where the argument still holds and we still need to win. But I think for the majority of people, and certainly the majority of activists, and I don't think that's just in the independence movement. If you look in the Labour Party and the trade union movement as well, I think you will find mass opposition to the siting of nuclear weapons at Faz Lane. The question for me really is, how can we take that support and turn it into something that actually is real, that gets rid of nuclear weapons? Now, obviously, for a lot of people, that's tied up with independence, and an independent Scotland, I think, would be a major step forward. But it doesn't guarantee we get rid of nuclear weapons, and I don't agree with that. There has to be pressure put on the Scottish Government and politicians to ensure that these promises are carried out. And in my view, there is a compromise there in terms of their attitude towards NATO, both in terms of the pressure that they will be put under to hold on to nuclear weapons and to delay their removal from Scotland, but also to be part of what will essentially still be a nuclear club. Scotland, if it's part of NATO, will still be part of an organisation which will use nuclear weapons. So in my view, we have to, the kind of base of the movement has to ramp up the pressure and put pressure on the politicians in the independence movement to actually carry out their pledge in the same way as we've got to ramp up the pressure on them to carry through on Indirect 2 and getting a second independence referendum.
Great. Thank you, Bob. And Isobel, how do you feel about that? Is the political argument one? How optimistic do you feel as you look kind of 5 years into the future that Scotland would be a nuclear-free country?
Well, I never take things for granted. I think you have to tie people in constantly. But I think the crucial thing here is, as with many other things that have been discussed today, is planning, planning, planning. That it's not enough to have sweet words. What we have to do on all these issues and all the many other issues around independence is to ensure that we have well worked out, detailed transition steps towards it. And then we can go to the Scottish public and say, this is not just what we want, this is how we're going to do it. We don't have this just now. Well, I mean, we actually have more of that work done on the issue of Trident. We haven't got it done on a whole lot of other things, but that's what's got to take us forward. And that's what will give more confidence with the Scottish public if we can say, this is how we're going to do it, and this is the timescale in which we are going to do it.
Fantastic, and that's again a really positive way to finish. Bill, Janet, Bob, and Isobel, thanks very much for joining us. I know we could have spoken about this so much longer.
Thank you very much.